And in fact, I already said in response to one of the questions that some of these things are things that people in the market know all about. Merck, the drug manufacturer, knows all about this. That's why that they gave so much money to the governor of Texas in his re-election campaign. He was a social conservative, and he came out and issued an order for HPV vaccines, something that was a kind of vaccine that fundamentalists were very worried about and thought was very risky. Why? Because it poses a threat to their values. Well, get him. He's like the advocate in the upper left-hand corner of our diagram. Merck realizes, which, you know, of course, and that you might say that's manipulative, but interest groups too, ones that want, for example, to make nanotechnology the new issue that replaces nuclear, which we earlier heard is becoming less important as a political focal point. They're going to use the guy on the lower right-hand corner of the diagram to tell people about nanotechnology. So it isn't as if understanding this and trying to systematize it when your goal is to promote receptivity to the best science is going to enable people who have other ends to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do. They're already doing this. So it would be a big mistake not to do it if you want to promote a climate in which people are receptive. That's the defense I would give to it, and recognizing too that it's very tricky. And Merck, for example, has botched it completely. Nobody trusts them anymore precisely because they were seen to be manipulating the identity of the cultural advocates. But my answer is that it actually is good to get as many people of as many different persuasions involved in the debate on all sides of the issue. Nobody sees that as manipulative. And yes, it's a cacophony, but in a cacophony, you don't have polarization. Polarization, right, not debate per se, is what I think delays and impedes the kind of enlightenment that eventually comes out of science.
Yeah, that's actually the point I wanted to address, partly following up on Keith's question, but also my discussion with Martin before. With respect to Keith's question, of course, it's not just the input variables that are different that you're measuring, it's also the output variable, which is some indicator of polarization. And the follow-up I wanted just to ask is, how certain are you in various contexts that polarization is such a bad thing? And I would at least toss out the argument, I'm not sure I want to make it, that after all, our social mechanisms, our regulatory mechanisms, in effect, in our culture, assume a great deal of polarization and presumably have adapted to it.
Well, I mean, this is a normative motivation, I mean, and a starting point, a reason to be, a kind of suspicion of polarization. In part, it might just be an intrinsic, a kind of liberal commitment. I think a lot of politics about risk regulation is really a disguised form of cultural conflict that in a liberal society is unfortunate. But even just thinking about the best regulatory policy, which is mainly what I think we should think about, it would be puzzling to imagine that cultural polarization conduces to that. Obviously, culture is a necessary transmission mechanism between scientific understanding and policy. Individual policymakers obviously aren't the scientists. They obviously aren't in a position to understand what the scientists discover on their own. Indeed, even scientists aren't in a position to understand anything on their own. They have to trust and work in collaboration with other scientists, which means that we always have to rely on some kinds of cultural practices, right? A simple point to identify what kinds of information is credible, who we can believe. Otherwise, we never make any progress. And it can't be the case that, I mean, there's no intrinsic relationship between somebody's values, whether they're a hierarchist and egalitarian, and the truth of science. And so if the cultural, the affinity people have is creating division, the bet that at a minimum is going to slow convergence on the best information that science can give us. It's a kind of interference in what should be the preferred cultural transmission routes for information. Obviously, that's very, you know, that's a very simple way to put it, and there you could even have normative arguments about why polarization is good. And maybe there are occasions in which the friction of polarization does something good for science, right? But that's my, I think in the main, that's the way I would see it, without saying either that that's a particularly profound or original reason to understand why polarization is bad.
We have time for one more?
Yeah. Oh, did we lose him?
Oh, did you lose me?
No, I guess you're here. Okay.
Well, that was just because I didn't really have a good answer, so I was Debbie, break up.
Hi. Hi, Dan. It's John Stone again. It was just, I guess this is a procedural question on some of the images that, in terms that you've used in the grid. You used communitarian in a picture of a person in a suit and tie in that upper left-hand corner as I was facing, that is different than the images I've seen Michael Thompson use and Mary use, where they call that quadrant the hermit, sort of the disaffected quadrant. So when did the switch go? You know, and the four topologies. When did the switch come about from the hermit to the communitarian?
Yeah, well, that's related to your last question. I mean, this I think is another difference between well, I don't know if we have a conception of cultural theory or just an alternative to it. I hate to say alternative because that wouldn't acknowledge the debt to Mary Douglas's conceptualization of these things. But we don't have the same understanding of the upper left quadrant, hierarchy and individualism, that she or most other cultural theorists do. As you say, they believe that the way of life and the affiliated outlooks in that quadrant are, people are either fatalists or they're hermits. I don't see why that would be so. I don't find the argument that somebody in that quadrant would have a fatalistic way of life cogent. I don't see why the convergence of hierarchy and individualism result in that. I don't see that as a worldview at all, but more of a kind of a disposition toward risk that's acultural fatalism that cultural theory supposedly doesn't accept. At the same time, I can see ways of life that are simultaneously hierarchical and individualistic. I think of the Marlboro Man, right? He's somebody who resists authority, resents it very much out on his ranch, but still has a lot of regimentation. There's a big difference between him and his wife and the cow hand and the Native American and so forth and so on. So there's a lot of, there's regimentation, but still a kind of isolation. And I think that does, that way of life does generate certain characteristic kinds of risk perception, some of which are risk skeptical and some of which are risk sensitive. And in my mind, that's compatible with another tenet of cultural theory. So yeah, we take issue with, or that's not how we understand that quadrant. We actually do have because we have this question comes up a lot, and we have a paper that it's just a working paper, but it's a cultural cognition as a conception of the cultural theory of risk, and it addresses that issue, but it also addresses the issue we were talking about earlier about the methodological collectivism of orthodox cultural theory versus the kind of the individualism of saying mechanisms of cultural cognition.
Okay, well, that will actually conclude this panel, so thank you very much for your time, Professor Kahan.